What's up, fabulous people? How you doing? Let me just get right into it. During World War I, there were over 40 million casualties. An estimated 20 million people died and 20 million people were wounded. During World War II, there were an estimated 70 to 80 million deaths, roughly 3% of the global population at that time. And understand this, that during neither war were there the nuclear capabilities in multiple countries as there are today. A world war today would lead to nuclear annihilation of the globe. It would be the end of civilization as we know it. The casualties and catastrophes of a World War III would likely lead to the end of the world. And if there are survivors, the world as we know it would cease to exist. So today I heard this interview with President Zelensky stating that he was willing and open to dialogue with Putin to end this conflict. But if there is not a resolution, it would lead to World War III.
So I think that we have to use any format, any chance in order to have a possibility of negotiating, possibility of talking to Putin. But if these attempts fail, that would mean that this is a third world war.
As a consequence of that rhetoric, I feel compelled to respond. The mere notion of world war is not something that should be even considered, especially considering that the current conflict is between two Eastern European sovereign nations. Currently, the conflict is not between any other nation around the globe except two Eastern European nations. There are 195 nations in the world. And of those 195 nations, 193 of those nations are not involved in this particular conflict. Western Europe is not involved in military combat in this particular conflict. Even other Eastern European countries are not involved in this particular conflict. To be more frank, Ukraine is not part of NATO. It isn't even a part of the European Union. It is a sovereign nation in Eastern Europe that is engaged in conflict with another sovereign nation in Eastern Europe. And why are they engaged in conflict? Honestly, there is no logical reason for the invasion by Putin. Anyone trying to decipher the logic or premise behind Putin's rationale for going to war is wasting their time because the logic is flawed. He argues that one of the reasons for invading Ukraine was to denazify Ukraine. That is illogical because irrespective of whether or not the entire country is a Nazi country, it is still a sovereign nation that has the right to self-determination. The argument that he invaded Ukraine because he wanted to make Ukraine part of Russia is also illogical because, as I said before, Ukraine is still a sovereign nation. And we are no longer living in a time where a sovereign nation has a right to carve out another country and claim that country for their own. If the argument is that Putin wants to ensure that Ukraine never joins NATO, that is also illogical because, again, Ukraine is a sovereign nation that has a right to self-determination. Therefore, there is no logical or justifiable reason for this invasion. And the suffering of the Ukrainian people, the casualties, the displacement, and the atrocities that are occurring are only happening because of that decision made by Putin. No other nation is responsible for those atrocities. So when Zelensky says this will lead to World War III if there is no resolution between him and Putin, he has no justifiable reason to say that. Because what is happening, as I said before, is between two sovereign nations. It is not a conflict that is directly affecting any other nation from a military perspective than Russia and Ukraine. It is not. Irrespective of your emotional or visceral reaction to the catastrophes that you see happening in Ukraine, it is not the responsibility of other sovereign nations to risk the lives of their own citizens in order to curtail or thwart the actions of a madman in Russia. The mere notion that the responsibility of this casualty falls on other Western nations to aid a sovereign nation in the defense of a nuclear power is irrational. So many people do not understand the kind of damage that can happen with this mere rhetoric. Because if the West decides to engage in this conflict militarily, what will happen is it will lead to nuclear annihilation. And all we have done is compounded the casualties we are seeing in Ukraine. We have now compounded those casualties globally. No rational, logical, democratic nation is going to engage in this conflict or be lured into this conflict to sacrifice billions of people for the sanctity and safety and security of one sovereign nation. So when I hear the media engage in endless propaganda in order to convince the public that nuclear annihilation is inevitable because it is the duty of us all to be willing to sacrifice humanity as we know it in order to preserve one nation, I have to object. And as a humanist, I believe in humanity as a collective. I believe that every human life is of great importance. I also believe that human beings should have the right to self-determination, as I believe a sovereign nation has the same right. Therefore, when those in the media are talking about sending other people's children to go and die in a war in which they have no vested interest in other than compassion for those suffering, when their own nation is not under attack, I feel compelled to repel against that kind of propaganda, because none of them in the media, none of them will be engaging in this war with boots on the ground. They will cover it for the ratings to increase, which is about profitability for them, and it is about the suffering for the rest of us. And you may be one of those people who sits there on social media, engages in cowboy rhetoric, claiming that we, plural, have an obligation to engage in this conflict, or that we are going to fight in this conflict. I ask you to revert to singular rhetoric, because you do not have the right to determine for myself or anyone else what is going to be our destiny. If you believe that your destiny is in Ukraine, you have every right to go and do that. And as a matter of fact, I find that admirable. But what is not admirable is when you believe that you have the right to sacrifice others' lives because of your own compassion. Your compassion does not supersede rationality and others' destiny. So go and fight if that is where you feel compelled to go. However, do not believe that compulsion now allows you to make that determination for 193 other countries around the globe. And when I say go and fight for Ukraine, I am not speaking hyperbolically or sarcastically or facetiously. I legitimately believe that if you believe that is your destiny, you should fulfill it. And just because I am saying that I don't feel compelled to fight, or I don't feel compelled to engage other people in the notion of them going and sacrificing their life, this does not mean that you have to be detached from what is transpiring in Ukraine. Contrarily, even Western nations have not been detached or disengaged from what is transpiring in Ukraine. They have rendered millions of dollars in aid to Ukraine. Multiple countries around the world are willing to take in Ukrainian refugees. Military arsenal has been provided to Ukraine. The globe has instituted sweeping and unprecedented sanctions against Russia. The condemnation has been swift and fierce. Therefore, it cannot be argued that this is disassociation from the conflict. Not to mention, numerous people have rendered aid to the Ukrainian people. And that is what has to continue until there is a resolution to this conflict. But the response cannot, at any time, be global engagement in World War III. That does not save Ukraine, and that does not save the globe. Therefore, I ask people in this moment that irrespective of how you feel about Ukraine, Zelensky, or the Ukrainian people, you have to ask yourself, what is the best way to preserve humanity, to preserve civilization, and to put an end to this conflict without annihilating the globe? And the only way you can come to a rational conclusion is when you have engaged in a sober analysis.